I came to the US at 6 months old. I think I flew into Philadelphia airport, which I haven't been to since. But my parents always tell me a lot of stories about the day that I came. We call it like Family Day. It was in December, and there's a lot of photos of me, and I look very disoriented because I have no idea where I am, and I think it's probably my first time seeing a lot of like white faces who are all crying and excited to be meeting me while I'm just kind of a baby. From there, I grew up in Old Bridge. It's like mid-sized town. I actually have no idea how big it is, but it was a pretty diverse town, so that was really nice. I had a lot of friends who were Asian, like Indian, just really multicultural area, and also very Italian. So my mom is Italian, my dad is Irish, and I grew up in a very like Italian-American household, and I think I identified with Italian-American culture a lot growing up. Just especially because I think every other person in the area of Jersey that I was in was also Italian-American. So I think there's a lot of like culture similarities in all cultures, but food was a really big one for my family. We would do a lot of like big dinners together, and I think they were a little panicked when they first saw me because my dad thought he wrote the airline description wrong. So I was the last person off the flight. I was adopted through like Holt, and they were supposed to have like a representative with my parents to have like a businessman pick me up, like who was on the flight as well. And he was the last person to get off the flight, and our representative wasn't there. So my dad was very convinced that I was missing and that they had no idea where I was. So when I finally came off the flight, they were just relieved that I was there to begin with, and a lot of crying. And I think they describe it as like, oh yeah, this was like the moment that we knew we found our daughter and like we were a family, which I think is nice. Love, definitely, like excitement, I think a bit of nerves. All of my like aunts and uncles were there too, so there was just a lot of passing me around to all of the family members to get pictures. Yeah, I feel really fortunate to have a lot of love in my family and my adoptive family. My mom has like a baby book. They never really said specifically like why they chose to adopt versus like other routes, but they just kind of decided to go down the adoption route and went through that process. So I've never really had a very direct conversation. I would say it was something that I grew up like knowing I was adopted, and I didn't question it very much. So I didn't ask too many details of like why they chose to adopt versus other options, or why they chose to adopt like from Korea versus other places or in the US, but it's interesting. So my earliest memories around adoption are when I was like maybe 2 or 3 years old. And it felt like at the time I had already known, like I always knew that I was adopted. My parents had like books about adoption, including one that was like, I think it was about a Chinese baby, but they were kind of like close enough. So it would be like a mom and a dad, and they were white, and then like an Asian baby in the center, and I would like point to it and I would be like, oh, that's me. So I think I've always known. When it comes to like, I guess the identity side of it, I think when I was in probably like a little bit older, like middle school or so, was when I started realizing like, oh, I don't look like my parents necessarily, so I can like, I have to tell people like, oh, those are my parents. My parents are white. I'm Asian, but my parents are white. I'm Korean, but my parents are Irish and Italian. So a lot of like clarifying, I think, started coming up when I was like in adolescence more. I think it's like always a changing relationship, the way I think about adoption and like family. You know, I obviously really think of my family as my family, and I know my parents are my parents. and at the same time, it can be complicated at times. Like as I was getting older, I think I was feeling like more self-conscious. My partner is like white, and sometimes I'm like, oh, do you look more like my parents' child, and I look like I'm like the girlfriend when we like all four of us go out to dinner. I think that's like moments where it's a little bit more, but at the end of the day, like when I'm just like talking about my family, I definitely feel confident in who my family is. I'm an only child, so I think I'm an only child and very much like pride and joy of my parents, which is both a blessing and a curse. Sometimes I think I stress myself out, but I have quite a few cousins. I have 4 cousins, and then all of my older cousins were married when I was in like middle school, like kind of big age gap. So they all were married, and then they had kids, and then those kids are now like teenage, college age. So I definitely grew up a lot in Jersey, like looking after all these little ones. And I was like really close with them when I was younger. My parents moved to Florida when I was in college, so I haven't seen them as much since my parents moved to Florida, but I still like get all the family updates about what they're up to. So I remember when I was really young, a lot of times a question I would get asked from both children and adults would be like, oh, do you miss Korea? Do you miss your mom? And a lot of times my like immediate response would be a very defensive, like, well, my mom is like downstairs. I don't understand what you're talking about. I know my mom, she's like right in my life. So I think the way I would think about my birth parents or like my birth mother was usually more annoyance when I was a child, because the way people would talk to me would be a little bit like, oh, don't you miss this person? And I'm like, I mean, I was 6 months old, so I don't really have any direct memories. So I don't really necessarily miss someone who I don't recall. I mean, you know, those thoughts have definitely changed with time. But I think that it was like important to me to not invalidate who my parents were versus who my like birth parents are. When I was young, I was definitely kind of dismissive of my birth parents. Like I was kind of like, oh, they're just the people who brought me into existence, and now I'm here, so I am existing here in the States and I have other things to focus on. I think I'm like someone who tends to exist in like the present versus looking back a lot, or questioning a lot about the past. So when I was younger, I definitely was a bit more like, oh, it doesn't really matter, or like I didn't think too critically about it. Growing up, it definitely changed and evolved. I know like I haven't had the like bandwidth to do a lot of digging for more information. I've always been really curious about like in the first 6 months of my life, like where I was. Like I don't really know the answer to that, so it's always been kind of a question mark on a big long to-do list of things. And I definitely feel that way as well about like birth parents or my birth mother, like what choices. I think I also feel some anxiety around it, just around this idea of like talking to someone and needing or likely needing like a translator or interpreter to better communicate, when it's hard for me to even put it into words in English. I've like thought about it and then kind of, I guess, pushed it aside a lot of the time. I've always had the idea of looking for birth parents or like finding people who took care of me while I was like at Holt or at like the adoption agency has always been something I was curious to look into, as I think part of revisiting Korea. But it's also something that, like, it's easy to think of that, and it's like so intimidating. So like breaking it down into smaller parts and processing those smaller parts is, I think, part of my plan and timeline of process. For me, a lot of, like, outside of my identity as a Korean adoptee, I also had like other chapters of my life, you know? So first it was like, okay, college, I went from New Jersey to Florida. Then when I graduated, I moved from Florida to Chicago. And then Chicago, I've had like a bunch of different jobs, and a lot of kind of life events have been taking priority over the past digging. So a lot of more of the like, well, I need to get this done before I can do that. And definitely I think there's like layers to it where you could do that forever. You could infinitely have life events that are taking precedence over other life events. But I know that it's something I really want to learn more about. Even if it's not to like find this like person, but just to like have information, I think is also valuable. To me, adoption is complicated. I think it, for me and for like my family, it really meant like having my family, and they're so like important and close to me. And at the same time, like two things can be true at the same time, right? So I think like it can also be something that's complicated and messy and can like have a lot of questions, and whether or not that is like a positive experience is definitely up to the individual, and it can be like hard at times. But at the same time, I think it's like a nice experience. I think I've had a good experience with my family, so I feel fortunate in that regard. But it also leads to questions, definitely. This is actually something that I thought was really meaningful during kind of the peak like pandemic in 2020. The Korean government like mailed me a package of masks that I signed. Like I think I signed up for them, but it was pretty easy to sign up. And because I was born in Korea, they sent them, and that felt really like meaningful. I liked having that like connection and welcoming sense of like belonging that came from that like really small gesture. I guess it wasn't very small at the time. It was at a time where masks were super hard to have access to. Through luck for me, like the chain, when I think about like how I found out about like Korean American communities in the Chicago area is like a chain where I went to a trivia event for a podcast that was completely unrelated, and I met someone there who knew someone else there who was Korean, who then like made that connection with me because she was like, oh, you're Korean too, and she helped like bring me into a lot of Korean American like events and Korean events in Chicago. So like if I didn't have that one little connection through my friend Charlene, then it would be like infinitely harder for me to have found a lot of those like resources, or maybe I wasn't looking very hard. I don't know, somewhere in the middle. I think like living in a city is so helpful to find those types of communities, but building those out at a larger scale for more like rural areas, or for like the suburban town that I grew up in that didn't have a lot of like Korean people there, I think that could be like a really valuable way to bring people in more. So one thing that I think I struggled with, or that many people struggle with, is that idea of like not being Korean enough, or being like not being enough of, or being enough of like an identity or like, do I deserve to be here, or do I deserve to be like interviewed in this space? And at the like same time, I feel like I am very much like, I'm the most Korean American story that I can be because I am. Like, I exist as such, and that can't be something that's like taken away from me because it just is who I am. And I think that's cool.